The day began like any other, with Mason Hunter rushing through his morning routine. He slid on his usual work shirt, straightened his tie, and caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. 32, with a few gray hairs creeping into his brown hairline, but still fit. His reflection gave him confidence. His life felt solid. Audrey was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. Mason leaned over, planting a quick kiss on her cheek. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, grabbing his travel mug. "Good morning," Audrey replied, not looking up from her screen. "You're running late." "Yeah, traffic's going to be brutal today." He took a swig of his coffee, grimacing as it burned his tongue. "What time will you be home?" Audrey barely paused. "Late? There's that dinner with Lucas, remember?" Mason nodded, trying to remember if she had mentioned it before. Right, the boss dinner. Lucas Cooper, Audrey's boss, had been the topic of conversation a lot recently. Mason figured it was part of the promotion game. He hated the guy's arrogant smile whenever he met him, but Audrey swore it was harmless. He walked into the living room where his mother-in-law, Ella, sat with her knitting, already immersed in her daily routine. "Good morning, Mom," Mason greeted, forcing a smile. He still wasn't used to having her around all the time. A few months ago, Audrey had insisted they let her mother move in just for a while after she lost her house in a messy divorce. That while had turned into months. Ella's constant presence sometimes made him feel like a guest in his own home. Ella didn't even look up from her needles. "Morning, Mason." Shaking off the tension, Mason grabbed his briefcase and made for the door. Before he could turn the knob, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Audrey. "Don't forget, I'll be out tonight. Important meeting with my boss. Don't wait up." Mason glanced over his shoulder at Audrey, who was now engrossed in her emails. A strange sensation tugged at his gut, but he quickly shook it off. Audrey was ambitious. She had been gunning for this promotion for months, and Mason respected that. He knew how much it meant to her, even if it had started eating away at their time together. With a forced smile, he pocketed his phone. "All right, see you later. Good luck with the dinner." Audrey gave a quick, absent nod. "Thanks. Don't stay up." Mason left, pulling the door shut behind him. Outside, the fresh air filled his lungs, but that strange feeling lingered. It gnawed at him during his drive to work, even as he listened to the morning news and dodged the usual heavy traffic. He told himself it was nothing, just the usual work stress and the increasing strain of having Ella around. But as he turned into the parking lot at his office, something about Audrey's text bothered him. "Don't wait up." She had said that before, but it felt different this time. At work, Mason's day unfolded as usual, filled with meetings, phone calls, and the endless cycle of tasks that consumed his time. He was good at his job, reliable, respected. His co-workers liked him, and his boss knew he was someone who got things done. But today, Mason's focus slipped. That nagging feeling about Audrey's dinner crept back into his mind, distracting him every few minutes. During lunch, he sat in the break room, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone. He thought about texting Audrey to see how her day was going, but something held him back. He didn't want to seem like the paranoid husband. She was working hard, pushing for a promotion that could make their lives better. Still, a thought flickered. What if this dinner wasn't just about work? He shook his head. Stop being ridiculous. By late afternoon, Mason tried to push the unease aside. After all, Audrey was probably stressed about the dinner too. She needed his support, not his doubts. But as he closed his laptop and headed out for the day, the tension in his chest remained. He checked his phone again. No messages from Audrey. Not even an update on how her day was going. Mason pulled into the driveway earlier than usual, eager to unwind after a long day at the office. He had decided to leave work early, hoping to catch some quiet time before Audrey returned from her dinner with her boss, Lucas. He hadn't been able to shake the uneasy feeling from the night before, but he was trying his best to trust her. The front door creaked as Mason stepped inside. The house was unusually quiet, save for the muffled sound of the television coming from the living room. As he walked in, Ella's voice greeted him with an unsettling casualness. "Hey, dear, you're home early," she said, not even glancing away from the soap opera playing on the TV. She had been lounging on the couch, wearing a worn-out robe, with a half-empty glass of wine on the coffee table. Mason frowned, speaking in the scene. "Yeah, just wanted to relax," he said, glancing around. "Where's Audrey?" Ella smirked. "Oh, she called. Said she needs you to go with me to her cousin's place tonight." Mason blinked, confused. Her cousin's place? Why? Ella didn't even flinch, her tone indifferent as she replied, "Because she's having her boss over here for a fun, wild night." As if what she had just said was perfectly normal. She waved a dismissive hand, her focus drifting back to her wine. Something about celebrating promotion talk or whatever. Mason's brows furrowed in disbelief. Celebrate? Celebrate what? His voice was sharper than he intended, but he fought to keep his composure. Ella sighed dramatically, finally turning to face him, with a look that suggested he was the one missing something obvious. "Oh, Mason, don't be stupid. Lucas is into her. She's just playing along. It's no big deal." Mason felt a tightness in his chest. His mind was struggling to catch up. "Playing along? What the hell are you talking about? And why am I supposed to go to her cousin's place?" With a condescending smirk, Ella tilted her head slightly, as if explaining to a child. "Audrey didn't want you here tonight. Said you'd probably embarrass yourself." Mason's heart pounded, a knot forming in his stomach. Embarrass myself? What does that even mean? I'm her husband. Why would I? Ella cut him off with a mocking laugh, her words dripping with condescension. "Oh, Mason, grow up. Lucas has been flirting with her for weeks. She's just doing what she has to do to get ahead. Can't you see that?" The room spun around him as the anger began to rise. Mason's fists clenched at his sides. He stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "What are you saying? What the hell are you saying?" But Ella remained unbothered, leaning back and taking another sip of her wine, smirking over the rim of the glass. "She even told me your little 6-inch problem isn't exactly cutting it in the bedroom. What did you expect her to do? A girl like Audrey can't settle for less." Mason's mind reeled, his hands trembled with a mix of shock, disbelief, and a fury he had never felt before. You knew about this? You're her mother." His voice cracked, his face flushed with rage. Ella rolled her eyes again, waving him off. "Oh, Mason, don't be so melodramatic. I know it hurts, but this is the real world. Audrey's just doing what she has to do. It's for both of you." Mason's entire body shook. He stood there, stunned, staring at her in disbelief. "Doing what's necessary?" His voice was hoarse with emotion. "You think this is necessary?" With a shrug, Ella looked at him as though his rage was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You should be grateful. She's working to get you both a better life. You're too narrow-minded to understand." For a long moment, Mason couldn't move, couldn't speak. The woman he thought he knew, the life they had built together, was unraveling in front of him. And the fact that her own mother had not only known about it, but approved, it was more than he could handle. The betrayal twisted in his gut like a knife. Suddenly, everything sharpened. Without saying another word, Mason turned on his heel and stormed up the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He threw open the bedroom closet, yanking out suitcases with such force that they toppled onto the floor. Clothes, shoes, anything that belonged to Audrey and Ella, he stuffed into the bags with shaky hands, his fury driving him forward. The zippers screamed as he dragged the suitcases downstairs, one by one, his chest heaving. Ella remained on the couch, casually watching as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. "Mason, calm down," she called out, her voice dismissive. "You're overreacting." He didn't respond. He couldn't hear her through the white-hot rage coursing through him. With a final burst of energy, he flung the bags onto the porch with a loud crash. Then he turned to face Ella, his voice trembling with fury. "Get out!" Mason bellowed, his voice cracking with the weight of his emotions. Ella blinked, finally pulling her gaze away from the TV. "What?" "You heard me," he snarled, stepping closer, his fists still clenched. "You and Audrey. Get out of my house, now." Ella narrowed her eyes, setting her glass down slowly as if processing what he'd just said. "You're kicking us out? After everything? We were just trying to help." Mason's jaw clenched painfully as he stepped even closer. "Help? You think this is helping? Get out of my house." For a moment, Ella just stared at him before letting out a huff. She rose from the couch slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "You're going to regret this, Mason. You're being completely unreasonable." But Mason stood firm, his eyes burning with fury. "I don't care anymore." Ella muttered something under her breath as she passed him. "Audrey's not going to take this well. You'll see." But Mason didn't reply. His world, the life he thought he knew, had been obliterated. Yet, beneath the crushing pain, something else was brewing. Revenge. This wasn't over. Hours passed before Mason heard the creak of the front door. Laughter floated into the house. Audrey's unmistakable laugh, light and carefree, but it was accompanied by the deep, smug chuckle of Lucas Cooper. The sound made bile rise in Mason's throat. Standing in the dimly lit living room, he listened as they entered the house, their voices low and intimate, as if they were the only two people in the world. He watched as Audrey and Lucas stepped inside, her hand grazing his arm while they shared a private joke, oblivious to the storm waiting for them. Audrey's smile faded the second her eyes landed on Mason, standing perfectly still in the middle of the room. His arms were crossed, and his gaze locked on them with an unsettling calm. Lucas, ever the arrogant type, gave Mason a once-over, his grin widening like he enjoyed the spectacle. Well, seems like someone came home a little early," Lucas taunted, his voice thick with condescension. Audrey's eyes darted between the two men, nerves creeping into her expression. She tried to force a smile, her tone faltering. "Mason, what are you doing here at this hour?" Mason didn't answer her directly. Instead, he raised a hand to silence her. "Congratulations," he said flatly, his voice cold as ice. "You and your worthless mother are officially moving in with Lucas. He can deal with you from now on." Audrey's face drained of color, her forced smile vanishing as his words hit her like a slap. Lucas's smug grin faltered too as he looked over at the neatly stacked boxes by the door, finally realizing the seriousness of the situation. What do you mean?" Audrey stammered, her voice shaky as her eyes bounced between Mason and Lucas, desperately searching for an explanation. Mason took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his eyes locked onto hers. "You really think I don't know what's been going on?" His voice was too calm, too measured. It sent a shiver down Audrey's spine. "You've been sleeping with your boss, and your mother's been helping you cover it up." He gestured toward Lucas with a bitter smirk. "All those late nights, the business dinners, this is what they were really about, wasn't it?" Audrey opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Her cheeks flushed red, guilt flashing across her face. She tried to regain her composure, taking a shaky breath. "Mason, please. It's not—" "Oh, save it." Mason cut her off, his voice rising, the anger boiling over. "Do you really think I'm that blind? That I didn't notice what was happening right under my nose?" Lucas finally stepped forward, his arrogance on full display as he tried to defuse the situation. "Mason, you're blowing this way out of proportion. It's just business. Audrey's ambitious. She's doing what's best for her career. There's no need to make this a bigger deal than it is." Mason turned his fiery gaze to Lucas, rage simmering beneath the surface. He took a step toward him, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Business? You're standing in my house, sleeping with my wife, and you call it business?" Lucas raised an eyebrow, completely unfazed. "Look, man, relax. We're both adults here. There's no need to take this personally." Mason's hands trembled with the effort to restrain himself. "Not personal? You've been screwing my wife. You don't get to stand there and act like this is some professional arrangement." Audrey quickly stepped between them, her voice pleading. "Mason, please, we can talk this through. It's not what you think. We can fix this." Mason let out a bitter laugh, the sound empty of humor. "Fix this? You've been lying to me for months. You and your mother have been playing me for a fool, and now you want to talk." At that moment, Ella entered from the hallway, drawn by the raised voices. She walked in with that usual air of entitlement, her expression set in a disapproving frown. "Mason, dear," she said in that condescending tone he had grown to loathe, "you're overreacting, as I've told you before. This is just how things are. Audrey's doing this for the both of you." Mason turned toward her, fury blazing in his eyes. "For both of us," he spat, barely able to keep his voice steady. "You think betraying me, humiliating me like this, is somehow for my benefit?" Ella crossed her arms, looking down her nose at him. "You need to grow up and understand how the world works. Audrey needs this promotion, and sometimes sacrifices have to be made." Mason's pulse pounded in his ears as he looked from Audrey to Lucas and then to Ella. The betrayal was etched on each of their faces. The anger he'd been holding back for so long finally snapped. Without another word, Mason grabbed a box from the stack by the door and hurled it onto the porch. The loud crash echoed in the room. "You want to live that life? Fine, but not in my house." Audrey flinched at the sound of the box hitting the ground. "Mason, stop! We can talk about this, please." But Mason was past talking. He grabbed another box and tossed it outside, his voice dark and menacing. "Get out! All of you! Out of my house!" Lucas, sensing the shift in Mason's mood, stepped forward, his tone still smug, but now tinged with annoyance. "Mason, let's not do anything rash. You're acting like a kid throwing a tantrum." Mason's gaze snapped to Lucas, his voice calm but lethal. "I'm acting like a man who's been betrayed. Now get out before I throw you out." Audrey reached out to grab Mason's arm, desperation creeping into her voice. "Mason, please, don't do this. We can still work this out." But he pulled away, his voice cold and final. "It's over, Audrey. You made your choice. Now you'll have to live with it." Ella, still trying to keep control of the situation, stepped forward, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're going to regret this, Mason. You're throwing away your marriage over nothing." Mason let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and cutting through the tense air. "Nothing? Ella, this is everything. You've been poisoning our marriage from day one. Now you can live with your lies somewhere else." With one last forceful shove, he hurled the final box onto the porch. Turning back to face them, his expression was cold and resolute. "Get out, and don't ever come back." Audrey stood there, her eyes welling with tears, knowing deep down there was no going back from this. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Shoulders slumped in defeat, she reached for Lucas's arm, and the two of them walked out, with Ella trailing silently behind. The door slammed shut, leaving Mason in the heavy silence. His heart still pounded in his chest, but for the first time in months, a strange calm settled over him. It was done. They were gone. The next day, Mason braced himself for a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, heartbreak, maybe even regret. But instead, all he felt was numbness. He deleted Audrey's number from his phone, blocked her on every social media platform, and started filing for divorce. His actions were cold, methodical, like he was on autopilot. The betrayal had broken something deep within him, but he wasn't going to let Audrey or anyone see him fall apart. The phone calls started almost immediately. Her name flashed across his screen, the same smiling picture staring back at him as though nothing had changed. Mason stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the answer button. But the thought of hearing her voice twisted his stomach. He let it ring through to voicemail. Then came another call, and another. Each time he ignored them, letting the calls stack up, refusing to listen to any of her messages. On the third day, his phone buzzed again, but this time it was Ella's name that appeared. A fresh wave of anger surged through him. Ella, the woman who had stood by and justified Audrey's betrayal, was now calling, acting like she hadn't been complicit in the whole mess. He let that call go unanswered too. After several more missed calls, Mason finally decided to listen to the first voicemail Audrey had left. Her voice was shaky, vulnerable, a far cry from the confident tone she used to have. "Mason, please. I know you're upset, but we need to talk. I made a mistake. I never wanted it to go this far. Please just call me back. We can fix this." Mason's jaw tightened as he listened. There was no real remorse, just panic in her voice. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done, only sorry that she had been caught. Without a second thought, he deleted the message. The following weeks were more of the same. Audrey continued to call, as did Ella, but Mason remained resolute. His focus was solely on finalizing the divorce. The affair became public knowledge at work, and soon, Lucas Cooper's name was whispered in every corner of the office. Everyone knew about the scandal between Audrey and Lucas. Mason made sure the divorce was public too. He didn't do it purely out of spite, though maybe a part of him enjoyed the idea, but because he wanted the truth out in the open. He wasn't going to let Audrey and Lucas quietly bury the mess they had created. People needed to see them for what they really were. Meanwhile, Audrey had moved in with Lucas, convinced that their affair would now flourish. She believed that her new life with him was just beginning, that Lucas would stand by her and maybe even help her rise further in her career once the dust settled. But cracks in her fantasy appeared almost immediately. At first, Lucas was the same charming, smug man she had fallen for, taking her to high-end restaurants and enjoying their time together out in the open. But soon, the excitement of their affair faded. Lucas became distant, treating her like an afterthought. Audrey first noticed the change when he started working late and didn't bother to tell her. She would call him, just like she used to do with Mason, but his responses were brief and dismissive. He was always busy or caught up in meetings. Audrey sensed something was off, but she refused to admit it. Not after everything she had sacrificed. One day, fed up with being ignored, Audrey decided to surprise Lucas at his office, hoping to reignite the spark that had started their affair. But when she walked in, she found him with a younger, attractive assistant, both of them laughing at his desk. The look Lucas gave her wasn't one of a guilt. It was mild annoyance, as if she was interrupting something trivial. "Audrey?" Lucas said, barely glancing up from his desk. "What are you doing here?" Audrey's heart pounded in her chest. Who is she? What's going on? Lucas leaned back in his chair, letting out a tired sigh. "I'm working, Audrey. I don't have time for this." Audrey's voice wavered as she gestured toward the assistant. "With her? What's happening?" Lucas waved her off dismissively. "We're done, Audrey. I've moved on." Audrey's world seemed to crumble around her. "You're leaving me?" Lucas didn't even bother to stand. He shrugged, bored. "What did you think was going to happen? We had our fun, but it's over. You should have seen this coming." Tears filled Audrey's eyes as she stared at him, her voice barely a whisper. "But you promised." "I thought—" Lucas cut her off, his tone sharp. "I never promised you anything. Now get out of my office, Audrey. You're making a scene." Audrey stood there humiliated as the assistant smirked from behind Lucas's desk. Without uttering another word, she turned and walked out, her mind spinning. She had destroyed her marriage, sacrificed everything for this man, only to be discarded like she was nothing. Nothing. Days later, a formal notice arrived from Lucas's office. She had been fired. No explanation, no apology. It was a clean, ruthless cut. Lucas had moved on without a second thought, leaving Audrey with absolutely nothing. Ella tried to comfort her daughter, but the tension between them grew unbearable. Their once close bond was now crumbling under the weight of their shared downfall. With no home and no job, they drifted from one cheap motel to another, barely scraping by. Ella, who had once acted like the queen of Mason's home, now found herself a spectator in the collapse of Audrey's life. "What do we do now?" Audrey asked one night, her voice hollow and drained. Ella sighed, the arrogance gone from her tone. "We'll figure it out, we always do." But there was no real belief in her words. They both knew the truth. There was no home, no job, no future. Mason, from a distance, watched them spiral into chaos. Every call they made, every desperate message they left, was met with silence. For the first time in a long time, Mason felt like he was in control again. He didn't need their apologies or their explanations. He had already won. Months passed, and Mason's life began to look brighter. He threw himself into his work, rising quickly in his career, and the weight of Audrey's betrayal slowly lifted. His days became purposeful again. Morning runs, business meetings, dinners with new friends. He had even started dating, dipping his toes into a life he hadn't imagined reclaiming. The nights were no longer haunted by Audrey's laugh or Ella's endless criticism. His home, at last, felt like his own. Quiet, peaceful, free from the chaos that once filled it. Meanwhile, Audrey and Ella's lives took a nosedive. After Lucas cast her aside and fired her, the harsh reality set in. No more lavish dinners, no more shopping sprees, no more comfort. They were left with nothing but each other and the wreckage of the life they had destroyed. Months of living in motels, relying on favors that quickly dried up, stripped them of the arrogance they once carried so proudly. Each day was a new reminder of how far they had fallen. Then, on a chilly autumn afternoon, Mason heard a knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone and assumed it was a delivery. But when he opened the door, his heart froze in disbelief. There stood Audrey and Ella, the two women who had torn his life apart, reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. Audrey's once perfect hair now hung limply around her face, her clothes wrinkled and shabby, far removed from the polished woman she used to be. Ella, standing beside her, had lost the sharpness in her eyes, replaced by a look of exhaustion and defeat. Her posture, once proud, was now hunched under the weight of their ruin. "Mason," Audrey's voice was barely a whisper, carried on the wind. We need your help." Mason's face remained unreadable, though inside he felt a storm of emotions churning. He couldn't deny the flicker of satisfaction that came from seeing them like this, but their presence also threatened to pull him back into a place he thought he had escaped. "You've got a lot of nerve," Mason said coldly, stepping out onto the porch, his arms crossed. "What do you want?" Audrey bit her lip, struggling to find the words. "We're sorry for everything. We messed up, badly. But we've lost everything, Mason. We have nowhere to go, no money, no place to stay. Please just let us stay here for a little while until we can figure something out." Ella, standing a step behind, tried to muster some of her old confidence. "It's been hard, Mason," she said, her voice trembling. "We never meant for things to end up like this. We thought we were doing what was best." Mason's eyes narrowed, and he let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Best for who? You think betraying me, humiliating me, and destroying our marriage was what's best? That's rich." Audrey's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking as she stepped closer. "I know I was wrong, Mason. I realize that now. But I didn't think it would come to this. I thought Lucas and I could have a new life together. But he used me and then threw me away." "And that's what you get for trusting a man who cheats," Mason replied, his voice full of venom. "But that's not my problem anymore." Ella, desperate to maintain some dignity, spoke again. "Mason, we're not asking for much. Just a place to stay for a little while. You don't have to forgive us. Just give us some time, please." Mason looked at them both, letting the silence stretch out. He watched as they squirmed under his gaze, their desperation palpable. These were the same women who had once held all the power, and now they stood before him, broken by their own choices. After all the lies, after the betrayal, they had the audacity to come crawling back to him. He slowly shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You really think I'm that blind? After everything, you believe I'd just let you walk back into my life as if nothing ever happened?" Audrey's sobs grew louder, her hands clasped together in desperation. "Mason, please. I don't know what else to do. We're begging you." Mason stepped in close, his face just inches from hers, voice low and dangerous. "You should have thought about that before sleeping with your boss. You should have considered the consequences before you let your mother convince you I wasn't enough for you." Ella opened her mouth to say something, but Mason cut her off with a cold look. "Don't even start. You're just as responsible. Actually, you're worse. You fed her lies, pushed her into it, and believed you'd never get caught." Ella's lips snapped shut, her face going pale as Mason's words hung in the air. He straightened up, exhaling deeply before delivering the final blow. "I want you both out. Now. Leave my property or I'll call the police," Audrey gasped, wide-eyed with shock. "Mason, please, we have nowhere to go." "That's not my problem." Mason's voice was calm, but unrelenting. "You made your choices. Now deal with them." For a brief second, Ella's face twisted in anger, but she swallowed it back, fully aware they had no leverage. They were at Mason's mercy, and it was clear there wasn't any left to give. Audrey's shoulders slumped, her sobs growing quieter as reality sank in. There was no forgiveness coming, no chance for redemption. Slowly she turned and began to walk away, Ella silently trailing behind her. Mason stood still, watching as they disappeared down the street, hunched against the cold. He felt nothing. No pity, no remorse. The ones who had tried to ruin him were finally facing the consequences of their actions. As the door clicked shut behind him, a sensation washed over Mason, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It wasn't just the temporary relief that came from taking control of his life again, but a deeper, lasting peace. He had finally closed the door on that chapter of his life. Months passed, turning into a full year. Mason now found himself in a new apartment, standing by the large window that overlooked the city skyline. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the streets below. As he gazed out, he reflected on how far he had come. The storm that once tore through his life had passed, leaving behind clarity and calm. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Grace, his new girlfriend, entering with 2 glasses of wine. Grace was everything Audrey wasn't. Kind, sincere, and supportive. With her, Mason never had to second-guess anything. There were no secrets, no hidden agendas, just love and respect. "Deep in thought again?" Grace teased, handing him a glass. Mason chuckled, shaking his head. "Just thinking about how much has changed." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Changed for the better, I hope?" "For the best." Mason replied with a smile, taking a sip of wine. He looked at her, appreciating how she had brought warmth and stability into his life. Grace had been a steady force, helping him rebuild after everything collapsed. With her, he didn't just survive, he thrived. They stood quietly for a moment, enjoying the peaceful evening. The kind of peace Mason once thought he'd never experience again. The memory of Audrey's betrayal still lingered in the back of his mind, but it no longer had any hold over him. Time and Grace's love had healed those wounds, replacing them with confidence and self-assurance. A year ago, Mason wouldn't have believed he'd be in this place, emotionally or physically. The man he had been, angry and wounded, was gone. In his place stood someone who had rebuilt his life, stronger for the trials he had endured. That didn't mean he hadn't taken some satisfaction in watching the downfall of those who had wronged him. He hadn't gone out of his way to follow Audrey and Ella's lives, but he heard bits and pieces through the grapevine. Their fall from grace had been swift and brutal. After Mason threw them out, they struggled to survive without Lucas's support. Audrey's career took a nosedive. Word of her affair spread quickly after the divorce, and her reputation was left in tatters. No company wanted to hire someone wrapped up in scandal, and Ella's interference only made things worse. The two of them drifted from one cheap motel to another, unable to hold down jobs long enough to climb out of the mess they had created. Ella's arrogance and pride only deepened their troubles, making it impossible to accept help from the few friends who hadn't already abandoned them. They had no one left but each other, yet even that connection, once strong, had crumbled under the weight of their choices. Mason had heard through the grapevine that Audrey and Ella's relationship was in shambles, constant fights, endless blame. Audrey accused her mother of pushing her into the affair, while Ella blamed Audrey for being too weak, for ruining what could have been their security. Mason didn't delight in their suffering, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction that came with knowing they were living the consequences of their actions. The life they chose, built on lies and betrayal, had led them exactly where it should. "Hey," Grace's voice pulled him back from his thoughts. She looked up at him with a soft smile. "Everything okay?" Mason nodded, placing his glass on the table. "Yeah, more than okay. Just thinking about how far we've come." Grace tilted her head slightly, her eyes studying his face. "You mean after everything with Audrey?" He nodded again, his gaze distant, thoughtful. "Part of me thought I'd never get past it. I thought I'd carry that burden forever, but now..." His words faded, lost in the moment. Grace finished for him, her tone gentle but sure. "But now, you're free. You've let go of that part of your life." "Exactly," Mason said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "It's over." And it was. For the first time in what felt like forever, the past didn't haunt him. Audrey and Ella were just distant figures, lessons in what he would never let back into his life. Grace smiled, sensing the shift in his mood. "Good, because you deserve to be happy, Mason. Truly happy." Mason pulled her closer, kissing her softly on the forehead. "I am happy. Happier than I ever thought I could be." They spent the rest of the evening together, laughing, talking about their future, planning a little vacation they'd been looking forward to. For Mason, the future no longer felt like a looming shadow. It was clear, filled with possibilities, and most importantly, his. He was in control of his own path, and no one was going to take that from him. Later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Mason found himself sitting by the window, gazing out at the glowing city lights. His mind wandered back to the man he used to be, the man who had been married to a woman who used him, disrespected him, and tossed aside their life for a fleeting thrill. But he wasn't that man anymore. He was better. He was stronger. Audrey and Ella were still out there somewhere, likely struggling to get by, but it no longer mattered to him. They had made their choices, and he had made his. Mason chose to move forward, to rebuild, to truly live. They, on the other hand, had chosen something else entirely. A smile played at the corners of his mouth as he watched the lights flicker in the distance. That chapter of his life was finally closed, locked away, never to be revisited. With that thought, Mason turned from the window, ready to fully embrace the life he had built, a life of love, respect, and, at last, peace.